Okay, so clearly now I am live. Hello, everyone. Hello, First United Methodist Church, Fairfield. This is Matt again. I am back. Richard Hyduke, Pastor Richard Hyduke, was kind enough to give me another opportunity to lead another Tuesday Bible study for you guys. I'm always appreciative of all the opportunities that he gives me, and the fact that he's given me a platform to use my voice and to teach us a little bit more about God's Word. She's, of course, given me creative control as well, which is always fun because I love control. I love getting to make decisions myself. You don't always get to do that as a 21-year-old. Usually in things like this, especially when you're doing a presentation, you're usually having somebody, sort of pick material for you. So I'm glad today to get to pick my own material, and we're going to be working from Mark chapter 5. It's a really interesting, at times, it's a bit of a roller coaster ride in terms of all the things that we're going to hear today. We're going to hear the first part of Mark chapter 5. There's going to be unclean spirits and possibly a demon-possessed man and pigs, and all kinds of weird and terrifying and interesting things. And then we're going to hear the second part of Mark chapter 5, in which we have probably one of the most touching, most tender stories that's presented in the gospel. So I hope that we enjoy that. And we're going to consult a little bit of Luke and a little bit of John to sort of put all of what we're reading today in Mark into perspective. So we're going to get started here right now. We're going to start it with a word of prayer. So if you will just join me in a word of prayer. Well, Lord Jesus, thank you for bringing us here this evening. Thank you for the technology that we get to use so that even in the midst of a pandemic like COVID-19, we're still able to listen to your word, to hear your voice, and to engage our minds in conversation about what you're trying to tell us. So Lord, I ask at this moment that you open our minds, you open our hearts, and you open our imaginations so that we can hear your words, that we can better understand it, and that when we leave from this place, when our computer screens are turned off and we go back about our lives, I hope that whatever is said here within these next few minutes leads us to live our lives in even greater obedience to you. We pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so Mark chapter 5, going to go out of the NIV translation. If you want to get your Bible out, feel free to do that. But I'm going to start reading, and we're going to read the first part of Mark chapter 5. I'll do a little bit of commentary, and then we'll do the second part of Mark chapter 5. So here we go. First part of Mark chapter 5, Jesus restores a demon-possessed man. They went across the lake to the regions of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons of his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs and allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and the countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told them about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them about how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell all the people in his region what Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. Wow, that's a lot. It's a very sort of interesting story. It's probably one of the more terrifying stories of the entire gospel. So let's break down what's going on in this narrative. So Jesus has just finished giving this incredible sermon. The whole crowd was there. They're up on the hill. He's in the boat on the lake, preaching to these people. Everyone, has their tickets to the show, and they're trying to hear this great knowledge that is coming from this man named Jesus Christ. And then the sermon's over. Jesus goes across the lake, and as soon as he steps onto the shore, there's this man there. This is a man who, and we're going to kind of see this a lot in Mark 5. Is that really a major theme of Mark 5 is desperation, just total and complete desperation, to be healed from some sort of affliction, healed from a sickness or something that's kind of latched on to us, something that's trying to take hold of our lives. Mark chapter 5 is about that. It's about turning to Jesus in the midst of just total desperation, where we're completely at the end of the line, when we just feel like there's absolutely no other options. There's no other way in which we can find any sort of healing, any sort of redemption to our situation. So this is where this man is at. I mean, he is just totally at the end of his rope. He is desperate, and in his desperation, he turns to this Jesus. Now, let me ask you this to kind of start that off with. So Jesus is just totally preached an entire sermon in front of a huge crowd. And if you're a public speaker, I'm a public speaker, how exhausting that can be. I remember, this is a kind of funny story. After my first sermon at Chapelwood, Lake Jackson, Chapelwood UMC in Lake Jackson this summer, I remember taking off the robe. I had worn a robe that day because I was so nervous. I just needed something to kind of comfort me in the midst of having to talk in front of 300 people. I remember taking off the robe after the service. I was relieved to get the sermon over, and it went well. But I took off the robe, and my light green shirt was now dark green because of the sweat, because of how exhausted I was from being in front of 300 people and talking to all those people. And I remember Peter Camerano, our pastor at the church, said, who dumped a bucket of water on you? He said that, not joking either, said, how did you get so wet? I said, that's sweat. And we, of course, just, sort of bursted out into laughter because I was so nervous and so exhausted at the end of giving a 40-minute sermon, because I usually tend to be pretty long-winded. So that's where Jesus is. Big sermon, big crowd. And yet when he's over, probably feeling like he needs to take a rest, there's this man who is just coming at him, comes to him, gets on his feet, bows and worships to him. But Jesus knows what's going on with this man. Something has latched themselves onto this man. Now, we don't really know what it is because there are different translations. Some people say the actual idea of like demon possession, that there's some sort of dark supernatural spirit that's overwhelmed this man. Some people sometimes it just says impure spirit. So when you think about impure spirit, maybe it could be something like a secret or a hidden sin, or maybe something about this man's character that is just totally overwhelming him. That's seeking to destroy his life. So Jesus says, come out of this man, you impure spirit, and the whatever is possessing this man, whatever it might be, says, what do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me. So whatever has latched itself onto this man, it knows the power of Jesus. It knows itself onto this man. He wants to just take it away. It's going to happen. So this spirit, this impure spirit, this demon type entity, it's clearly afraid of Jesus. It's afraid of his power. Let's ask a few questions here, just from kind of this first little bit of the narrative. How willing are you? Because Jesus is pretty willing to help anybody, even when it probably is not the right time, and even when it inconveniences him. And let's ask that question. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to help people turn to Jesus even when we've just finished with our 8 or 9 hour work day, or it's not the best exact time in our life, because talking in front of how many people were there that day, that huge crowd, probably wasn't the best time for Jesus to do some kind of work like casting out a demon. He might have been exhausted, but yet he does. He turns all of his attention onto this man. Do we do the same thing in our lives? When it's not convenient, when it's not easy, do we put the right amount of attention on people that we need to put on them? Do we really invest in people and help them, turn to Jesus? Do we shed a light on that? That's just a question to kind of start us off for the Bible study. So Jesus asks this man, what is your name? And the man says, well, my name is Legion, for we are many. And he begs Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. So this demon knows that, if Jesus wants to completely send us out of this man, free us from this man and let us go, then he is absolutely able to do that. So Jesus sees this large herd of pigs feeding on the nearby hillside, and the demons beg Jesus, send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them. And he gives them permission, and the impure spirits, of course, come out, and they go into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rush down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. So whatever impure spirit, whatever spiritual, supernatural entity, demon is inside of this man, Jesus unleashes that into these pigs that are, feeding on the hillside. And what happens? They run down the hillside and they jump into the water and they drown to death. Okay, so that's a pretty violent image, if you ask me. That's a pretty scary image. Sounds like something straight out of a Stephen King style horror novel or horror movie. Let's ask ourselves this, because this is really an interesting thing. There's a lot of animal sacrifice in the Bible. Most of you know that. If you're an animal rights activist, it's probably not the easiest text to read. It's pretty violent, and there's a lot of animal sacrifice. And one of the things that they would do in the Jewish world, if someone needed to be atoned for a sin, of course, is to bring an animal, a sheep or something, a lamb. They would bring it into the synagogue, bring it to the high priest, and they would, I'm going to be, pretty graphic here. They would, cut the lamb's throat, and the blood would, gush out. And usually whoever, of course, had, committed the sin would, get the blood on their hands, literally and sort of metaphorically speaking. But the psychology of it was this: what is happening to this animal should be happening to me because of this transgression, this sin that I have committed. Same idea kind of is presented here a little bit in this passage. We know from what the pigs do, from running down the hill into the lake, we know from the action of the pigs what the impure spirit, what this demon was trying to do to this man. It was trying to end this man's life. It was trying to completely destroy him. That's just, it's a terrible thing to really think about. It's incredibly scary, but we get the psychology of it right there. And all the people in the crowd that day would have seen it. But let's ask ourselves this question a little bit, kind of speaking in these kind of terms of having something latched onto us that's trying to destroy us, right? Because, like I said, once this thing is released from the man, it goes into the pigs. What happens to the pigs? They go into the water and they drown. So we know that whatever was latched onto this man was trying to destroy him. Let's ask ourselves this question. As human beings, as people who live lives and who are kind of influenced by their culture or influenced by their experiences, or just maybe it's just part of human nature, is there something about us, each and every single one of us who's watching this, is there something that is latched itself onto us and is trying to go about destroying us, creating chaos and confusion into our lives, and then eventually slowly bringing us to our ultimate demise? I mean, that's kind of the verse of, John 10:10. It's, the thief comes to what? Steal, kill, and destroy. That's the goal. Um, and this, in terms of literature, this is something that's this idea of there is something about human beings, of every human being, there is something that's trying to actively destroy them. This is something that we see present throughout all sorts of great literature. Think about Shakespeare's plays, right? Think about something like Othello. Othello kind of starts the play as this very confident, cocksure general in the army, and he's got control. And when he walks into the room, everybody is all eyes on Othello, and he commands the space. I mean, he's a person who is just overwhelmed with certainty. But something happens. Iago, who of course is a part of Othello's army, Iago, who believes that Othello is his friend and really is very loyal to Othello and loves Othello. Well, Iago becomes jealous when Othello promotes Cassio above Iago. So Iago, enraged by the fact that he's been so loyal Iago, so enraged by the fact he's been so loyal to Othello and has invested so much into building a relationship with Othello, so upset by that, Iago is able to convince Othello that Cassio is cheating on his wife Desdemona. And what that does is it plants the seed of doubt into Othello's mind. So we have this person who's always walking around with this arrogance of complete certainty, but as soon as this seed of doubt is placed into Othello's mind, well, I'm not going to spoil the whole play for you, but it does lead eventually to Othello's demise. This is something that Shakespeare was really good at in his plays. He understood that attached to every single human being is something. It could be a character trait. Think about Iago in the narrative Othello. The thing that really kind of destroys Iago, because Iago also meets his demise by the end of the play, the thing that destroys Iago is his loyalty. Iago is a loyal man. He is all for Othello at the beginning of the play. He is in love with Othello. Iago kind of believes that him and Othello were like this. But when Cassio is promoted over Iago, it just totally destroys, this sort of idea that Iago had in his mind that him and Cassio or him and this is really difficult because it's a Shakespeare play. There's all these moving parts, but him and Othello were like this. It totally destroys. It destroys, in a sense, his perception of how much his loyalty was appreciated. It destroys his perception of how much he thought that his loyalty was something that worked towards his advantage. And the problem is this, loyalty is a virtue. It's a good thing to have, but Iago did not have other virtues to sort of contextualize his loyalty. Iago was loyal, but he wasn't wise. He didn't understand that just because you're loyal doesn't mean that you're always going to get the promotion. That doesn't mean that people are always going to do right by you. So in a sense, when Iago feels like his loyalty's been betrayed by Othello, Iago goes from somebody who's working constantly for Othello and is loyal to Othello to somebody who is actively trying to betray Othello and is working against Othello. So both these two characters, Othello and Iago, both have these character traits that actually end up in their demise, which is just really kind of fascinating. And that's a common theme in all of Shakespeare's narratives. Hamlet, his problem is he's an intellectual, but this terrible event happens with his father's death and his uncle taking the throne. So he uses all of his intellectual abilities to manipulate other people. And eventually, of course, if you know the story of Hamlet, a lot of people meet their demise as well. Romeo and Juliet, attractive young people, clearly very charismatic and charming, but there's this terrible situation with the two fighting families. And they do not understand, in a way, the politics of it all, and they don't really understand the conflict, and they're so invested in their love for one another that they wind up making very harsh decisions at the end of the play when they realize that they can't be together. So this is sort of a common idea in Shakespeare's narratives, right? Within every human being is something that is after us. It is our Achilles heel. It's trying to, take from us. It's trying to make our lives into chaos. It's trying to bring us to our demise. I'm sure some of you watching this from your homes probably can see that within someone that you know. You might even very well see that within yourself. And it doesn't just have to be a character trait. It can be a character trait that you have. It can be an addiction. It can be something like an obsession. Sometimes people fall a little too in love with their political beliefs, or they become too obsessed with another person, and that thing winds up totally messing up their entire life. It really makes their life into a living hell. So thinking about that and thinking about what this man's going through in this text, demon possessed, there's something latched onto him. It's trying to actively seek to make chaos out of his life. But this man makes the right decision. Why does he make the right decision? Because he brings that, whatever it is, we're not really quite sure what it is in the text. It could be some sort of actual demon. It could be some sort of his impure spirit. We're really not sure from all the different translations, but whatever it is, he brings that thing to Jesus. Have you done that in your life? Do you know other people in your life who might need to do that? Do you know people who have a character trait or have something about them that's actively every single day trying to end their life? Are you wise enough yourself, and are you also kind enough yourself to bring other people actively trying to save the person? See, because that's the difference. I said the enemy comes to what? Steal, kill, and destroy. What does Jesus come to do? He comes to redeem and save. Had this man not have turned to Jesus in the right amount of time, the same thing that happened to those pigs, right, would have happened to him. He would have drowned, either maybe literally, maybe metaphorically, in his own misery, in his own sort of God-forsakenness. But he does the right thing. He turns to Jesus. Imagine if all of those characters, Othello and Iago and Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, all those people in those Shakespearean plays would have taken the moment to pray. Seriously, think about that. If they would have taken whatever was bothering them, whatever was, kind of getting at them as a person, what if they would have taken those things to God? Might they have... might their situations have gone a little bit differently? Maybe they would have been able to view their situations not from their perspective, from more of a God's eye perspective. That's just sort of something that we see in this first part of John chapter 5, is there is something about every human being that's trying to destroy us, but there's also a Jesus who, if we turn to him, is going to begin the process of actively trying to save us. But the point is that, do we have for ourselves, do we have the wisdom? Do we have the humility to turn to him with those things? And that's, of course, in relationship to ourselves, and in our relationships to other people. Do we have the courage? Do we have the sort of alertness? Do we have the kindness to say, hey, I know what you're struggling with, but I also know this Jesus who can save you from this thing. So that's sort of the first idea from this first part of Mark chapter 5. I think I might have said John chapter 5, but Mark chapter 5. So we're going to go now to the second part of Mark chapter 5 and make this really quick. This is Jesus raises a dead girl and heals a sick woman. When Jesus had crossed again over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. So probably, another sermon given and more people trying to come at Jesus, more needy people. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and she spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes? You see the people crowding against you." His disciples answered, "And yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed of your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came to the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and said, "Your daughter is dead. why bother this teacher anymore? Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples were with him. He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by hand and said to her, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was about 12 years old. At this time, they were completely astonished. She gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told him to get her something to eat. Okay, let's kind of go through this really quick. Or at least as quick as we can, because this is, like I said, there's a lot going on right here as well. So here we are. Jairus, the synagogue leader, tells Jesus this terrible news that his daughter, his young daughter, is surely dead, just completely lifeless. But of course, like I said, we're talking about desperation here, and just desperation, Jairus comes to Jesus because he knows that Jesus can bring about a miracle to the situation. He's, like I said, at the end of his rope, and Jesus is now his only hope. And so they're walking to go save this child, and yet we see this woman who she's been bleeding for 12 years. We don't know, maybe it's internal, external bleeding, but she's been suffering from this terrible condition. And she had also suffered under the care of her doctors. Does that sound? Does that sound? I see. We get a comment from the online ministry. I just noticed that. Does that sound? Does that sound similar to anyone that you've ever seen, or maybe to a situation that you've been in medically? You've gone through all the doctors. Maybe there's just been complete ignorance towards the situation. They've tried everything that they could, tried to get you on medication, saying, well, this works for, all the people that we put it on, so this should surely bring about some healing and some change to whatever, medical ailment you're having. And you go through that, you go to the doctors and you take the medication, you do what they're telling you to do. And a few months later, nothing has changed. And they say, well, I guess you're just the exception. It worked for everybody, but it's not working for you. Or maybe there's been medical malpractice. Maybe there's been, some people who have not been acting in your best interest. They've just been, taking things away from you, your money and your time, and your situation still hasn't changed. So this is kind of the situation this woman's in. This is, like I said, at the end of the rope, right? Even the doctors can't help her at this point. She's been suffering for 12 years, and there's just been absolutely no healing. There's been no change. So this woman is absolutely desperate. I remember, reading about medical trials at one point, and all the risks that are involved with medical trials, and all the, all the complications and how difficult it is to get into a trial, and at the end of the day, you might go to all this trouble to get involved in a medical trial, and it might not work. And I remember talking to my brother about that. I remember talking to Michael about that and saying, why would people go to all this trouble just to get into, this medical trial that at the end of the day might not even, change their situation? And he said, well, you just don't understand what it means to be that desperate, So this is where this woman is. She is just that desperate. And she comes to Jesus and, of course, doesn't even, kind of talk to him face to face or tell her about her situation. He just touches his robe, hoping that touching his cloak, touching his robe will heal her ailment, and it does. It changes her situation, and she is healed. So from that perspective, and then something kind of really interesting happens here too. The bleeding stops, and she feels, and in her body, she of course feels freed from her suffering. So why not just walk away, right? Why not just go and enjoy her healing and just go right about her life? But that's not what happens, because Jesus says, look, someone, I feel like some power has been exerted from me. I feel like there's been a change in someone's situation in the crowd. Can we find that person, and can we point them out? So why would Jesus do this? Why would Jesus try to find this woman who's been healed? Why not just let her, like I said, go about her healing and go about her life? But I think the reason why Jesus does this is because he wants to make a statement about faith. He wants to make a statement about this woman's faith and the power that this woman's faith has had in changing her situation. It reminds me a lot of, if any of you remember, I believe it was the Angels We Have Heard on High sermon that Richard gave at the church in December. Same idea, right? Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. People have seen healing, people have seen redemption, people who've seen change and hope brought into hopeless situations. Don't go about those things privately. Share them with other people. Why? Why do we need to share our stories with other people? Because it gives other people hope that there can be change brought to their stories. And it also gives people hope that that Jesus can come into whatever kind of pain or suffering is happening, and it can and that he can bring about real change to the situation. So Jesus isn't necessarily trying to turn the attention over to himself. He's trying to turn the attention over to this woman and to this woman's great act of faith. And why would he do that? Probably because he wants other people to respond the same way in faith, right? This woman, despite 12 years of disappointment, of probably heartbrokenness, anguish, anxiety, anger, she still had enough faith in her to go seek out Jesus, to find him, to touch his robe. And because of that, she was able to see change in her situation. And Jesus, of course, wanted to point that out to other people, not to bring attention to himself, but so that other people might follow suit, that they might act in the same way. And then the second part of it, of course, as I've said before, is just the fact that telling your story, right? If you are one of those people who has a faith story of Jesus coming into a hopeless situation and bringing about change to that situation, I would say you need to tell other people about that, because stories are the things that give people a lot of hope. Because people will say, well, if it happened for you, surely it can happen for me, and that will also inspire other people to bring whatever hopeless situation with all of their desperation over to Jesus. So don't hesitate at all to ever, give your testimony or to share your story. All right, this last part right here, we're talking about this young child, this 12-year-old girl, Jairus' daughter, who's of course dead, and everyone else, of course, is kind of with the situation. They're like, well, the situation is hopeless. It's over. Why even bother this Jesus person anymore? This woman or this child is completely dead. And yet, same thing with Jairus, right? An act of faith, holding on to faith, holding on to hope, in the midst of a situation that feels like there's nothing good to be brought out of it, still holding on to the promise that Jesus can come in and that he can change the situation. So we have the second part, everyone's saying, well, there's no reason for Jesus to even be here. This girl is dead. It's far over. And yet what happens? We see Jesus with the child's father and the mother coming in to the situation. They're coming into the room in which this young girl is lying there dead, and Jesus grabs her by the hand and says, it's time to get up. And she does, miraculously. And she begins to walk around, and she's just 12 years old, which is really kind of interesting too. I just remember reading that and thinking, usually what age do we do confirmation in the church, right? We do it at about 12 years old, because in a way, it's almost the same. It's kind of follows this idea of Jesus coming into the situation, even that of a child, and grabbing that child by the hand and saying, time to get up, time to have a life, because that's what Jesus does. He comes into a situation and he grabs us and he tells us to wake up, tells us to have life again, and not just our life, but his life. And of course, these people are completely astonished, and he gives them strict orders not to tell anybody. And we'll kind of finish here. Just says, give the girl something to eat and don't tell anybody. Why would Jesus do that? Because one of the things, like I said, one of the themes of Mark chapter 5 is desperation, turning to Jesus in the midst of desperation, turning to Jesus when all the other options have not worked. And the only option at this point is to put all of our faith in Jesus. So one of the themes, of course, is, turning to Jesus in desperation. One of the themes also is turning to Jesus in an act of faith. And then there's also this theme, this idea of when Jesus comes into our situation and when Jesus redeems what we thought to be irredeemable and changes what we thought to be unchangeable, and brings hope into all of our hopelessness. Jesus wants us to tell other people. He tells that to the man who is freed of this, this entity, or this, this impure spirit, this demonic spirit that's, sort of latched onto him. I keep doing this because, latched onto your shoulders. He tells this to the same woman who, touches his robe, go and tell other people, right? He points to her situation, not to point to him, but to point to the fact that this woman had an act of faith, and because of that, her situation was changed. But here he says, no, don't tell anyone. Don't let anyone know. Why? I'm not 100% sure why. I can't tell you why, but I also know this. Jesus did have a moment, and we talked about it last week. Jesus did have a moment in which he let other people see and let other people know in his ability to raise from the dead. And of course, that was Lazarus. So I don't know really what to take from that. Maybe the thing we can take from that is just our timetable is not necessarily God's timetable. And, clearly there was a time for Jesus to show his power to raise people from the dead, but maybe this just wasn't the time. But really, I guess, I know I've been kind of babbling on here a little bit, but we're about to get finished up. But the three things that I would just take away from this Bible study are: one, the willingness to turn to Jesus in our desperation, and also our willingness to turn others to Jesus in the midst of their desperation, even if it's inconvenient, even if it inconveniences us. Because like I said, Jesus doesn't care about being inconvenienced. Just gave a sermon in front of a big crowd, immediately goes to work trying to heal this man. Maybe there might be four things we take from this. Number two, there's something usually latched on to all human beings that's actively trying to destroy us and make chaos and confusion out of our lives. We need to identify that thing, and we need to have the humility and have the courage to bring that thing to Jesus in prayer. Number three is just faith. Right? Putting your faith into something, even when you're at the end of the road, even when everything you've invested your faith into has failed you, continuing to hold on to your faith and instead putting your faith in Jesus. And then number four is just, like I said, let the redeemed of the Lord say so. If something good happens to you and you've seen Jesus Christ come into your situation and actually bring about healing and change, tell other people, let other people know, because those stories give people hope. They shed a light to the fact that, there is something out there that can come into their rough spots and bring about change. So never be afraid to tell your story. That's really kind of a really important message from this whole thing. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm really grateful that Richard gave me a second opportunity to come back here and do another Bible study, and we'll pray real quick, and then we will end our Bible study. Let's pray. Lord, we know that many of us watching this are desperate. Many of us are at the end of the line. We just maybe can't see any other options. And if we're not in that situation, there's a good chance that somebody that we know is in that situation. So God, in the midst of our desperation, help us turn to you, help us turn to Jesus, and help us turn other people to Jesus so that he can do the work that we can't do, so that he can bring about change to things that we thought could never change. God, once again, thank you for this time. Thank you for just the availability of this technology for us to do these things. And I pray all these things in your son's name. Amen. All right. Thank you guys so much for another Bible study. And I really appreciate it. All right. Peace.